Anyway, my name is Ed Battistella. It's my privilege to be the president of the Friends of Hannon Library this year. And this year we're celebrating the Year of the Library. It's the 50th anniversary of the Friends of Hannon Library, the 30th anniversary of our partnership with the Friends of William Stafford, and the 20th anniversary of the building expansion that has sort of created this nice new renamed building, the Lennon-Dixon Hannon Library. So welcome. It looks like our board members, Friends of Hannon board members, to wave their hands or stand up. Every April we induct new board members, so if you have an interest, feel free to reach out to us. We usually begin with the SOU land acknowledgement, so I will proceed there. In our the Friends of the Hannon Library want to take this moment to acknowledge that Southern Oregon University is located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Lagawa peoples, who have lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of the homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians people of this are living descendants of the Takelma, Shasta, and Lagawa people. We urge you to learn more about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people. So with that, I want to turn to tonight's topic. Tonight's topic is about archives. I was just talking with one of our board members about her experiences trying to get archives for medieval manuscripts, and comparing my experiences getting archives for more recent things. And one of the things that archives bring to us is they document things. Some things are sort of monumental manuscripts, like some of the things in our special collections. Other things are very sort of everyday workaway pieces of ordinary history, letters of resignation from this or that organization, bits and pieces of correspondence between editors and publishers, and so on. So archives cover a vast array of things. And tonight's panel is going to talk about their experiences with archives. So I'm going to just briefly introduce them, and then you'll hear more from them because they're the main attraction. So on my on the extreme right, Professor Mark Tveskov, archaeologist and ethnographer in the Sociology and Anthropology Department. Next to Mark is Hannah Archambault, Assistant Professor of History in the History Department. And right here is Professor Chris Lucas of the Communication Department, an expert on digital media and documentaries. So I'm going to sit down and ask a couple of questions. And as we go, anyone who's sort of immediately motivated can start. I'm not going to, or people can just sort of stand there with their schoolyard look on until somebody says something. So what I want to ask everyone a little bit on the panel is what's been your experience working with archives? You know, creating them, using them, and so on. So anybody who's ready to go can jump in, and I'll pass the microphone along.
Sort of go down the line. I hope this mask isn't getting in the way of this now. This is I'm on some medication protecting me from big crowds, so I'm not sick and getting away. All right, so as a filmmaker, as an educator, archives have been really important to me. You can all imagine the importance of archives for documentary. The films I've been involved with have used archives, everything from sort of high level collections, like the Ransom Center at the University of Texas, to kind of more private collections, or even very informal collections by like groups of activists or people in the community who want to get their story told, right? So this takes all kinds of shapes. I think I'll leave it for there. That's mostly my experience, has been in looking for these materials as a researcher, sometimes for other people, sometimes for my own projects. And then, yeah, seeing what the world can show us that people have been saving. I've gotten a lot more interested in the last few years, for reasons I'm sure I'll talk about later, about the importance of having more archives in this region. And I hope we get around to that.
Is this working? Good. Okay. I hate using these things. I was very awkward with them. I'm not sure if I ever had the opportunity before to introduce myself through my archive, and it's kind of a cool opportunity. So as a historian, the area that I work on is really kind of early modern India. So 16th through 18th century is kind of my wheelhouse. And the stories that I like to tell often take me through really different kinds of archives. So I read, Persian or Urdu manuscripts, some of which there might be one or two copies existing in the world. I also read kind of generic day-to-day, kind of humdrum British East India Company officialese, kind of bureaucratic administrative texts, and everything in between those things. And as a result, I work in archives both in the Indian subcontinent and also in Britain, in both state archives and also in private archives. And I think that distinction is often really important to pay attention to. And because I work both in a former colony and in the former colonial or the imperial center of that colony, I also get to see a lot of the difference in terms of the kinds of resources that are available in those archives. So I'm also happy to talk about some of that this evening.
And my involvement with archives goes back to the beginning of my career. I've always been involved to some extent in the study of settler colonialism in North America and with regards to indigenous people. So I started in New England with the Pequot and Narragansett, working with those tribes and understanding their colonial history as an archaeologist and a historian. And then I came to Oregon and started working on a similar project with Western Oregon Indigenous nations. And so archival research has always been part of that. One of my most significant engagements with archives was in the 90s, where I worked with a group of Indigenous scholars from Western Oregon tribes to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. This was a project called the Southwest Oregon Research Project, which was also a lesson to us because what is that called? When you have a word with letters? An acronym. We made up SWARP on the spur of the moment, and we were stuck with it for the next 20 years. But that resulted, we went to Washington, D.C. and worked in the National Archives to identify archival material relevant to Western Oregon Indigenous people, and that was repatriated to all the tribes of Western Oregon. That was a big project I did as a graduate student. Yeah, and I continue to do archival research to this day.
Back to me. Well, one of the ways to get a sense of why archives are important is to talk about what people have found in them. So I wonder if each of you could maybe say something about the most important or most surprising or most unusual thing that you've come across in an archive. You want to start? You have one?
This is just a story that's convenient because I was just looking through this text, so I can tell the story and it's fresh in my mind. But I mean, I think pretty much anyone that's worked in an archive will have dozens of favorite stories of things I find. But I wrote a paper this summer on the basis of a manuscript that I first encountered in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. It's the Tuscarora Muluk. It's a early 17th century Persian manuscript that purports to tell the history of a handful of different states in southern India. And I was quite compelled by it because the author seems to be really interested in trying to describe landscape and trying to kind of make some sense of this sort of unstable boundary between built and unbuilt spaces, and is kind of philosophically inclined, I might say. And there's a section of the text towards the end where he stops and he says, you know, there was a period of time when I had a garden. I was living in this place and I had a garden, and every morning I would go out into the garden and I would look around and I would see all the flowers that I'd planted, and then I would look at the orchards that were planted beyond the boundaries of my garden. And I would see there that these spiders had built webs overnight, and the webs were perfect in every possible way. And in the very center was this kind of very ornate structure that was about the size of a head of garlic, it's a bulb of garlic rather, which I thought was kind of a beautiful image. And he said, you know, it was amazing to me that these small, vulnerable creatures who, you know, are so weak could build such wonders each night. And then every day, these people who are sort of unnoticing and uncaring walk through the webs and destroy them. And then every night, the webs are reconstructed again. And it was just this beautiful little moment. And as a gardener, I was also kind of compelled by the story of the garden itself. And it's a very human moment, I think, a kind of a really shared sense of just observing detail.
I had a really negative story, and it's hard to follow. But I think the human moment is key, because I think I can think of a couple of particular moments. But one of the things I love about archival research is when I hear the people's voices. It's like almost, it might also relate to the fact that social scientists lack social skills, so we're better being friends with people who are long dead. But like when you're heavily engaged in archival research, I hit a point where there's enough documentation with one person. Like, I've done a lot of work with anthropological archives where an old anthropologist from 100 years ago was interviewing tribal people, and they would spend days with them, and I'm reading their field notebooks. And after a while, I could hear their voices in my head, and like, they're familiar to me. And I love that so much. It's like they become kind of like friends or something. And it's really a human moment, like you said. I guess when the question was first asked, one of the moments I remembered in particular was working in the Bancroft Library at Berkeley, which is this amazing repository of Western Americana. And it stems from the famous 19th century historian Bancroft, who did this multi-volume work of the history of the American West. It's really kind of an amazing achievement. And he and his associates went all over the West in, I guess, the 1880s or so, somewhere in there, and interviewed all these people about their experiences in the settlement, quote unquote, settlement of the West. And so all these interview transcripts are in that archive. And one of them was with a man named John Ross, who was a captain of the Southern Oregon militia during the Rogue River Wars that we heard about in the land acknowledgement. And his presence haunts the valley in some weird ways, like Ross Stanley Road and Ross Lane, and that's where his homestead was. And he was a proud and was remembered as a proud, quote unquote, Indian fighter here in Southern Oregon. And Bancroft himself interviewed him somewhere near Jacksonville, maybe at his house. And at the Bancroft, I was reading this notebook, the interview with this guy. And Bancroft himself he was very professional, and he was asking him all these questions and writing down all these anecdotes about the so-called Rogue River Wars. And I'm not going to get the quote exact, but at the end of it, or on the back cover, he wrote, and he apparently it was long into the night, and Bancroft wrote something like, And thus I spent the night in the presence of this terrible Indian butcher with blood on his hands.
Wow.
He wrote all this stuff, just kept it really professional. And then at the end, he felt compelled to like record that at the end. And that was really poignant.
I guess I could share a story that, is really memorable to me because it's a story of two archives in a way. A film I helped complete like 10 years ago that was a story of a direct action against the Keystone Pipeline in East Texas that was not really in the news that much, but there was a lot going on in that part of the country. And in the construction of that story, which was largely built around the activists, we really needed to tell some of the story of the oil industry in Texas, and went into archives mostly around Austin and University of Texas. And they have there was a pretty new organization at that time called the Texas Archive for the Moving Image, which was really focused on collecting moving images, which of course are most of interest to me, that were from all over the state, and included a lot of what would often be considered sort of ephemera, like family movies and some corporate stuff and commercials, these things that Ed was talking about. But they did, it's a small organization doing a really professional job of collecting this material and also making it available for not too much money, which was really good for us. And so we were, able to find some kinds of images of the early days of the oil industry in Texas that I just really hadn't seen before, and also sort of painted a picture of the kind of rise of the power of that industry, which then contrasted very well for us with our story, where in the course of making that film, we realized the activists were doing their own filming of what they were up to and creating social media out of that and the kinds of things you would expect these folks to do. We didn't really have a sense of actually how organized and thoughtful they were about both building, but then also protecting that archive. And there's a lot of concern about protecting people's identities in this film. But once we realized, that archive was there, that collection, archive is probably too strong of a word, but the relationship that we had with those folks, they were willing to share that with us. And it became a huge part of the sort of finale of that film, because we had our footage, which was, sort of cinema verite style, kind of on the ground, a lot of news kind of feeling to it. But we then had the other side of this confrontation. And one of the challenges of maybe my work, Neil could speak to this, but of course we had to clear every second of that footage in terms of copyright and permissions to put it in a movie, which became its own major adventure to find, these folks who really didn't want their names known, but be willing to negotiate with us or with me to include this material. But yeah, that was a very early experience of mine, but it was a really interesting contrast of like this kind of really, the stuff that gets archived and the stuff that often doesn't.
Thanks, and that's a great segue to the next question. But first, I wanted to sort of share my experience with this. The most exciting things I've found have been things that archivists have sort of serendipitously found. So I've been working on some research on a writer who lived here in Ashland for a while, and I spoke to the archivist at the Motion Picture Academy, and also the archivist at Columbia University to try and find some information on correspondence between this writer and her agent, and this writer and some other people who were on the Screen Actors Guild board. And the archivists in both cases came back and said, no, we don't have anything about that, but we've got this other stuff that you might be interested in. And in both cases, the archivists came up with these terrific gems, a series of correspondence or material from the board meeting of the Screenwriters Guild that were directly relevant. So particularly those of you that are students and researchers, just ask a question and the archivist will reshape that question into something that's helpful to you. So the next question that I'm hoping folks can weigh in on has to do with sort of the idea that not everything can be in archives. We'd sort of like everything we want to be in some archive somewhere, but how do scholars decide what's worth archiving and how it should be described?
Okay. So, I mean, it's way of my pay grade, but this is a huge issue, and it's really on my mind because we live in an increasingly visual culture. YouTube will tell you that 500 hours is being uploaded per minute to YouTube. Hundreds of thousands of hours of content a day. We're just awash, right? And that's just one platform. Whether any of, how much of that is archive worthy, that's a probably different panel. But I would say that moving image archiving has its own special challenges, like the amount of space and data and care for preservation, description is pretty immense. And I don't know, I think it's a challenge for us. I think it's going to be really important for us to have rich moving image archives. There's dozens around. I mean, Library of Congress, of course, has enormous collection. There's dozens of these, even some in our region doing a lot of work. But I do think for moving images in particular, that I think university libraries have a really important role to play in trying to figure out what can be saved, especially within regions where it's a little bit of a smaller bite of or drink out of the fire hose, or use our metaphor. Yeah, that's what I've got.
I feel extraordinarily lucky to be able to answer this question from the early modern position, because I think the extraordinary bounty, if that's what we want to call it, of modern kind of information production is a whole different ballgame. But in my universe, we treasure every little piece of text that survives, and it kind of almost doesn't matter what it is, we can figure out something to say about it. But I will say that in a way, it hardly even bears saying, but what is in the archive and how the archive is organized and whether those materials are translated, because English remains the dominant language of most scholarly work, is really an important part of what kind of stories we're able to tell. And so I'll give you the example from the field of that I know best in India, where across most of the 20th century, the kinds of histories that were told were primarily interested in courts, primarily interested in state formation, and of course, primarily interested in the lives of elites. And it was assumed that most people that were living, that were not part of that elite sphere, were essentially irrelevant, that they were acted upon by powerful forces, perhaps, but that really the story, the thing that's important, is happening in these elite spaces. And that it takes a very long time, interestingly, in South Asian history to kind of have people come around to a new interpretation of that. But it meant that starting in the 80s and increasingly in the 90s, archives began to be examined in really new ways. So whereas a lot of earlier work had been based on translated and published work that had been available, broadly accessible. A lot of it's probably sitting in publication and on the shelves here in Hannon. Those stories no longer, for some reason, felt like they were enough, and people started to dig around in the dark corners of, uncatalogued shelves that were covered in dust, and to begin to look for new kinds of materials. And so they started to pull out these old kind of like regional histories told about kind of localities or less important families. They started looking at wills. They started looking at the petitions that had been brought forward to courts, asking for justice or redress by some king or kind of local official. And as a result, we're now having a kind of renaissance of a sort in the study of South Asia that allows us to tell this history of kind of everyday life, and to think about non-elite actors as not just kind of participating in history, but actually shaping history. So we used to think about things like caste, for example, a really important kind of social form in India, as being a kind of timeless, age-old traditional thing that never really changed until the colonial period. And now we can go back and talk about how this was in fact quite political and constantly changing, and a really powerful means by which people did politics in this kind of early modern period. And so, I guess this is kind of a way of getting back to the question that you're asking, which is like, what is worth saving, what's not worth saving? We don't really know what kinds of questions historians are going to ask of their archives. The kinds of questions people asked of the archive in 1980 are really different from the questions they're asking now in the 2020s. And I would hesitate to make any guesses as to what people are going to want to know about it, 100 years from now. So my tendency is to want to say, a broad swath of materials is the safe bet. That's not maybe I don't know if that's a very satisfying answer for that, but there you go.
Yeah. So I agree, and I don't know how to evaluate what should be saved and what shouldn't be saved, but the question makes me think about what a state of flux our archives are in right now because of digital technology and that YouTube fact that you said. And even in the course of my career, I've seen this pretty radical change. So it's like, I don't think we have a handle on how it's working, and the changes in technology and access, which have positive and negative effects. So in my experience, in the old days, you had to go to the physical archive and you had to negotiate the labyrinth of social relationships with archivists who were often too busy to talk to you, and you had to sort of demonstrate that you were serious before they would actually help you. And that may sound like negative, but it also required you to be diligent and think and actively engage the process, as opposed to pushing a button and then all this information comes out at you from the internet where you can't even evaluate the quality of it, right? And yeah, and it's really complicated, but maybe inversely, in the old days, like a scholar who'd been around a while would kind of collect materials and hoard them. I think of it like the dragon and the hobbit, like sitting on those materials. And then a junior scholar would have to say the right things to get maybe access to that stuff. And then now, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, but we have this amazing archive in Southern Oregon run by Ben Truey from the Historical Society, where he has meticulously transcribed primary documents of our history and made them publicly available for everybody. Now, he is a rare case because at first I didn't trust him, but then when I cross-referenced what he was doing, he was obsessive about the accuracy of the material. And even though he wasn't trained in that field, right? So there's this really Catholic approach where it's everything is available to everybody. So it makes it more inclusive. And that's a product of the technology. And then there's also aspects of sovereignty to that too. So when I was a graduate student, those anthropological archives, for example, one of the archives was at the University of Washington, where this famous anthropologist named Melville Jacobs had interviewed indigenous people all up and down the West Coast. And he was a UW scholar, so all of his field notebooks were in his archive at that archive. And to get access to them, you had to go through a lot of hoops and you had to say what you were going to use the information for and what form. It was kind of like the film business. And I resented that a lot, you know, because like, I don't know, to go there as a graduate student and do all that work and actually have to count for what I might potentially use that information for. But then in that same period of time, the tribes were asserting their rights or as they saw them to the same material. So just a few months later, a colleague of mine from one of the tribes had gone through all those hoops and gotten all the same information that I did and like just gave it to me as PDFs and said, this is our stuff. You can do whatever you want with it. So, you know, it's a whole, you know, it's really, that's the kind of complexity that we're in right now. And I don't think there is an answer, but the fire hose thing is a factor.
If you don't mind, I might just double down for a second on the gatekeeping thing, because it's a
Yeah.
really important component of archive culture in the subcontinent. And I would say that my experience of that was complicated by being a young woman who was in the field and who was constantly forced to kind of perform her expertise in various different ways. So there's that component of it too. Also briefly, dragons. I like to think about the British Library in London as being like the dragon's lair, where the dragon dragged all of its like sort of valuable stuff back and sort of sat on top of it. So
Yeah.
visit the British Library, it's like, oh, I get to go to the dragon's lair. So I appreciated that you also saw things in terms of dragons.
Yeah, and related to that, like there is a distinguished scholar of Pacific Northwest history who is in the process of retiring, just as Ben Truey is building this amazing publicly accessible archive. And that scholar in his royalness is like auctioning off his collection. And I'm like, we don't need it because Ben's already just transcribed it for everybody for free, right? And in terms, and yeah, gatekeeping for sure. But still, in sympathy to the archivists, like I worked at I did research at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. for months on end. And you know what? In Washington, D.C., there's a lot of people who want to know about their Civil War ancestors. So like I'm in the reading room at the National Archives, and those archivists who are overwhelmed with demand and underpaid. But because of this demand from the public, they have some things figured out. So I'll be sitting at the reading table reading this stuff, and I can hear in the background all day long, Confederate or Yankee, Confederate or Yankee. They got like funneled into these like avenues where they could easily access these like Civil War and military records.
I've had some time to collect some anecdotes too. So I'm glad you mentioned Ben, because he's not only doing that work, but he's also doing a lot of video.
Yeah.
KOBI at some point handed off, that's the local NBC station, handed off their newsreels from the 50s and 60s to the Historical Society over in Medford. And Ben has been, you know, taking a lot of time providing huge service, turning these old film reels into video and finding some real gems out there. A lot of that is, I think, going on YouTube actually. But yeah, so I wanted to shout that out. And I also wanted to mention, kind of coming back to the original question about what is saved, and I really can't agree enough with this point that you don't really know how this, how this is gonna go. I teach a unit in a class that I do on film festivals about the emergence of, LGBTQ, or what we later call queer film culture, and how, there was that film culture in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s, but of course it was very underground. And these are very small communities, often geographically located, and with a lot of incentive to not save anything, right? But there were some thoughtful people who did save film, but also really important materials like programs and posters and biographies of filmmakers and so forth. Puts it in a box, and it ends up in maybe somebody's private collection or in a library somewhere. And then it's like 40 years later, and scholars get back and start to write this history. And yes, there was this really important queer film culture, going back decades. Um, yeah, so it's amazing, yeah, amazing stuff to be found.
Yeah, and these are some great discussion here of the way that technology changes what we're able to archive and access. And even technology like programs being online, they're not going to be archived in the same way. The way that intellectual advances change the sort of things we need to find in archives, right? As we look at history in a different way. Um, the way that we access something 50 years ago is not going to be relevant today, or as relevant or relevant in the same way. And finally, there are these questions of ownership and who has rights of access. And if we even go to AI, you know, what AI can do with archived materials. So there's a lot there to be sort of sorted out by scholars and archivists and the public, I think. And the next question, this may be the one that will sort of segue into the discussion, the sort of Q&A after this. What should Southern Oregon be archiving for future scholars? And not just Southern Oregon University, but Southern Oregon broadly.
More moving images, please. So I think, I mean, it's a great question because I think, you know, to tie this back to questions of ownership and sovereignty, there's already a lot of amazing work happening with the tribal nations to do this. There's grant money out there to help organize community archiving workshops to help existing communities begin building archives on their own terms. And then hopefully kind of taking that next step to make those archives findable, searchable, to kind of connect into larger communities if they're open to doing that. I think that's work I think is really important. You know, I think, you know, I just told the story about the Queer Film Festival materials and writing those histories. But I think, you know, there's definitely, you know, there are areas of this culture and of this nation that are, you know, they're easily forgotten if the stories are not there. That's sort of a geographical question, sort of like it's kind of class question. And I think there's a lot to be told in this region about the nature of work and labor and you know, just the history of the region that would be great to have more collections for. Maybe they're out there already. And I think there's just, you know, that when I think of this region and as a storyteller, that's the stuff I'm hoping to find. Came here from living in Austin, and there was a wealth of different sorts of archives, including this organization, the Texas Archive of the Moving Image that I mentioned. And, you know, I think it turned out to be a really powerful intervention in that area. And I think it'd be great to see something like that around here.
I'm trying to figure out how to say I have no idea academically. Yeah, so we have the general idea that we don't know what's going to be significant to the next generation of scholars, and then the idea that we should save everything as a result of that. And then the question of how do you do that effectively and in an organized fashion. So I guess I'm sitting here thinking about the question of Southern Oregon in particular, what stories are slipping away from us just as we're sitting here that we're not seeing as slipping away. You know, and I don't know if particular examples are useful, but there's a stereotype of Southern Oregon of, you know, the hippies came out here in the 60s and the 70s, and now that generation is getting older, and it's like, what about their stories of, you know, because there are, you know, anecdotally, we hear those stories all the time, you know, are those being collected? Or I'll tell someone, an archaeologist, and they'll tell me a story of how their dad used Camp White prisoners to harvest pears back in the 40s or something. I'm like, that's a cool story. Is that written down somewhere? And I don't know the answer to that, you know. So I don't have an answer to that question, but those are the things I think about.
I feel like I'm at a definite disadvantage. But I will say, if I'm sort of forced into an answer here, that a lot of the work I've been doing recently has been thinking about how landscapes are imagined and about how landscapes also shape what is imaginable for us. And so I'm thinking about that in the context of Southern India, but I think there's a lot of potential here in the Rogue Valley for thinking about how our landscape has been formed and about the record of that. And in particular, I guess this is me speaking as an Ashlander whose family have been here since the 60s, and we have property outside of town. We have water rights through TID, and TID feels to me like a very sort of iffy kind of situation right now. Like there's a lot of questions about water supply. There's a lot of questions about who's using this water, and the way that that organization is trying to grapple with some really rapid change. And I would be really interested in kind of thinking about how the sort of institution of the Talon Irrigation District has actually shaped our landscape in really powerful ways, and how we might be looking at quite rapid transformation of our valley if we were to lose that. And I'm not quite sure what that would look like, but I think I'd be really interested in sort of thinking about maps and old aerial photos, and about also the kind of this is again just be thinking about my family, like thinking about the experience of talking to the ditch riders and of the people that do the kind of day-to-day work of opening and closing canals and gates and things like that, and the farmers that use that water and how their water use has changed over time. So if I were in a different university historian of Southern Oregon, that would be where I would go with that, I guess. But
I want to speak for just a second about this challenge of saving everything, right? Which would be awesome. But I do think there's a lot of conversation about digital and the role of digital in the ability to save more, which at least in the case of moving images is often not the solution. Digital turns out to be relatively unstable and difficult to manage and expensive and energy hogging technology. There's been some interesting writing among archivists about really kind of one of the current challenges is this middle generation between film, which can be pretty stable, and then they move to magnetic media, tape, VHS, so forth, and then into optical media, all of which turn out to be terrible media for preservation and storage. And now digital has its own challenges. But there's a sort of this 40 or 50-year period, and what some of these folks are saying is we really have a limited window to try to preserve a lot of that material. So there's some concerted effort on that. But I think so what I was going to connect this to was that we have, in some ways, space is just having the space to have a repository is a really good thing. It doesn't have to be massive servers and massive infrastructure. You may need, we'd love to have the people to catalog and create the finding aids and all of this. But I think we do have some means to at least begin collecting repositories here. So that's one positive.
Yeah, thanks. And I think now I want to open it up to all of you, and you may want to weigh in on what should be archived in Southern Oregon, or you may want to ask questions or share your own experiences. Vicky.
I'm trained as a medievalist, and so my archival experience very different from this. A couple of things that occur to me. I don't really need it. A couple of things occur to me. Number one, the manuscript culture needs to be preserved. I mean, we're talking a lot about moving images, and my career was all in Atlanta, and we have access to StoryCorps, and we did a lot of things with that. But to come into an archive and actually look at the manuscript. How often was this used? What's the use pattern on it? I hate that I did this, but, you know, I have some manuscript pages that I used with my students because I wanted them to feel what the difference is between vellum, which is calfskin, and paper, so that they could experience that, so that they could see the prickings, how lines were made, catchwords, the things that maybe a digital image is going to pick up, the marginalia, all of those things are so important. And this whole dragon business is, oh, I can give a chapter and verse on that one. You know, where you have to, you know, promise a kidney before you get to see the original manuscript, especially if it's a single extant manuscript that's really important. So, you know, these are considerations too. You want these things to be digitized and preserved, but at the same time, they need to be observed, handled, looked at carefully. And you know, my fear is that's going to get lost over time. Anyway.
Can I respond to that? I guess I'm not a medievalist, but I'm almost that. I really appreciate the conversation about the kind of materiality of it and the tangibility of it. And that if you open up a manuscript, at least in the Persianate context, you often have stamps that show, you know, who owned it. And to be able to kind of go back and look at the record of ownership, and to also be able to see like where people are doing marginalia, where people have like really worked over a page a lot, so you can really see like almost fingerprints and that kind of dirt on the page. In India, a lot of old texts are preserved by putting neem leaf in between the folios, and so opening it up and having like neem leaves kind of fall out that probably haven't seen the light of day in centuries. Is really cool. So I really appreciate that component of it. But also I will say, I too have concerns about essentially the politics of digitization in India in particular, where there are really heavy-handed politics, particularly with the current government in power. What gets digitized and what does not could mean that we lose access to really important elements of India's history. And so, you know, I think that's important in a lot of different contexts, not just in India, but it's the one that kind of immediately comes to mind there.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And I think what you describe is great. And negotiating all that, not just the tactile experience of it, but negotiating the archives, even when there's negative things about it, the dragging part of it, it makes you actively engage the process and the politics of digitization, but also then just receiving that information. It's so flat and hard to evaluate, and it has no, I feel like if you just absorb that, you don't have as good a capacity to critically evaluate it. And again, a local example of the difference between the real stuff and the digital, there was recently a big celebration because someone published an online atlas of indigenous territory. So you can go online on an app and you can point to a geographic location and it'll tell you whose tribal territory you were in. And it sounds great and it was celebrated, but if you actually, it's completely uncritical. Like it gives you digital polygons, and there's no meta explanation or expectation that you have any understanding of how those things are constructed. And when I look at parts of that I know really well, you know, there's so much that's problematic about it, but it imparts this like incredible sense of uncritical authority. Like this is the truth, right?
Yes.
That you lose by not physically tearing it apart, like in that palimpsest kind of way, and understanding its origin. And you know, that's both tactile and also intellectual, and then about active learning and a critical eye that's lost a little bit in the digital expression.
I think I might just add to that one of my big fears is that we sort of allow these platforms like YouTube and so forth to become these de facto archives, which in fact they are not at all. And they are highly structured environments, and you know, the algorithms of, you know, that are sort of driving what people are seeing and the way it's encoded, and of course belonging to Google, and you won't get into the copyright over policing, I would say, on YouTube and platforms, but yeah, I think it's, you know, there's a lot of, there's a lot of these kinds of control that isn't necessarily being recognized. And, yeah, it's gonna play into power politics, and it already is.
So I think, yeah, Ayo, you have a question.
Well, I don't have a question, but it's a comment. One of the observations I've been making is that over time, in the next 2 or 3 decades, I think people are going to be looking back at these archives to see what was growing. So your idea about the landscape, and I'm thinking, of course, I've got a vested interest in this one, but archives of farmers who, what they grew, when their crops came in, the kind of thing that the extension office may have. One of the flotsams was I put into the Southern Oregon Historical Society all of the garden parties that AAUW had for the past 30 years. So anybody who wants to go back at some time, and here's these wonderful photographies of plants, what the location was, where they were, whether it's a north slope, south slope, all of those garden information for people to look and see what could be grown here at some past.
That's great. Other questions, comments? Nope.
I don't know if I need the microphone or not.
I just want to ask, I have a colleague at the University of Denver, an archivist, and she's doing some work with some student groups in archiving student protest movements, like current student protest movements. And that made me have a question for you in terms of, especially the wide variety of archives that you use in your own research. Like, how do you engage your students, or do you, in talking about archival research, or engaging them in those processes, or just having them become familiar with that type of information resource?
Jonathan knows the answer to this. But, some of it's difficult because a lot of the work I do is in other languages, but one of the things I did was I had all my methods students read, handwritten early 19th century manuscripts in English, but it was very difficult for them, as I understand. And just kind of to get a sense of like what it feels like to have to go word by word and be like, what is that word? What is that word? And really slow down the reading process a lot. So that was really fun.
Especially at a time when students can no longer read cursive.
Yeah,
Can't read a letter from grandma.
And in particular, this was copperplate written by somebody who was probably learning English as their 3rd or 4th or 5th language, because there's South Indian and would have spoken Tamil as their first language.
It's so time consuming to do this. So I think in the context of a lot of art classes, especially for filmmaking, it's hard. I have a student here too, former student, who had the pleasure of doing some archival, like documentary work that was using archival material that was donated by people that we were working with in the area of the Guanajuato relationship in Ashland. So that was a kind of a fortuitous example. There's some pretty good online resources I've been able to use. Media Digital History Archive is a free site run by a number of media historians that collects, art. It's not necessarily all moving images, but it's more like documents and scripts and programming notes going from way back into media history. And those can be really fun to build assignments around, just to sort of get a better sense of the political economy of media and how media gets made.
I think I don't do a great job at this, because you can talk about like source criticism academically, but in a way I sometimes feel like to really get into like archival primary document research, that operates on a time scale that's slower than like a class or even an undergraduate. By the time an undergraduate gets engaged with what they're doing, it's like it almost takes too long. So you could do exercises in class by reading primary documents and talk about it, but it is really difficult. It really is at a point where a student has to do it themselves to some extent.
All right, I want to be careful to respect everybody's time, so we'll do one more question, but before we do that, I want to encourage everyone to check out the SOU archives and special collections. There's both digital archives and Southern Oregon Digital Archives, special collections, some local writers, lots and lots of material from the university archives, including old copies of the student catalogs, faculty senate meetings.
That's just what people want to read.
It's always about parking. Student newspapers, yearbooks, and so on. So if you're looking for a sort of doable archiving project as a student, there's plenty there. And also to check out the material in the hallway on the second floor, the Hearn collection of writing and publishing, which has some vellum pieces and that nice Mayan chunk, which I'm surprised is still here. So we'll take Tony's question and then wrap it up.
Thanks. We've heard some excellent cautionary advice about digitization and its perils. I wonder if any of you see some positive aspects to digitization, and the kinds of things I'm thinking of is it, although you wouldn't have that materiality that you refer to immediately at your fingertips, at least you could search maybe across different archives so that you don't have to go, say, from Chennai to Mysore to Bangalore, just in search of one particular thing that you're hoping to find topically. Also, I think there's an interesting question that arises, and this goes back to what do we save and how do we save it with digitally created documentation of any sort, which is, I guess, what might be called version control. Yeah, if you have 20 versions of a document that, say, a bunch of people were weighing in on, how do you represent that, index that? What do you store? Do you discard early drafts? You know, there could obviously be value in preserving early drafts of the document. So I'd just be interested in hearing people's insights about what positive aspects there might be to digitization and computerization too.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great, a great point. I mean, findability, I think, is, you already mentioned it, that's really huge. And just having, you know, searchability, but also the, you know, reference images are really great for the work I do. I don't need to see the entire thing. It's like, yeah, that's something I might want to take a look at.
Yeah.
So that's digitalization is great for that. And then that ability to maybe have more dispersed archives, and that we can be more in a networked environment where communities can hold on to, maintain ownership, sovereignty, and so forth, but and make decisions about how to connect, right? I think those digital connections allow that.
I agree that there's often really good things about digitization. One of the things that makes my life a lot easier is that I've been able to take digital photographs of most of the manuscripts I work with, which means that I can do the really slow, hard work of going line by line and reading texts that are not easy to read. You can't just kind of go in and sort of skim it. And another component of that is that there winds up being these really kind of wonderful communities of sharing those digital texts. I know a lot of scholars, and we all trade PDFs with each other, and they're transnational communities of sharing. None of these texts, by the way, are anything like under copyright, so there's no concern there. But I will say that the question of findability can be really great. So thinking about actually a text again that Jonathan's familiar with, this kind of 12-volume long diary by a mid-18th century guy who had been writing in Tamil. It's translated, it's in English, but it's 12 volumes long. And OCR is a beautiful thing. It means that you can go through it and you can kind of look for keywords and things like that. But there are limitations in that Indian archive, and I'm gonna say maybe 80% of material in those archives has never really actually been cataloged. And then you might be able to go so far as to say, well, there's a burlap sack and it's full of documents, and we think it has to do with the, 19th century in this state. Like, we don't really know what language it's in, right? Nobody's ever read any of this stuff. And so there's no kind of sense of there being any findable keywords or anything like that at all. You really have to go there and dig through it. It would be lovely if that stuff got cataloged. Unfortunately, it hasn't been. The other thing, of course, that's wonderful about digitization is sometimes you can actually save archives that way. So I'm thinking in particular about a really important archive that sits in Chennai, that the last time I visited it, was just completely worm-eaten, almost just like laced to open up the documents. And unfortunately, I was not given permission to photograph it, but I went ahead and I did so as much as I could because I knew that I might be the last person to see it. So I hold those documents and I wait for somebody who might be interested in.
I agree with all of that, and we need the digital and the accessibility and the ability to share, and for all those reasons, it's necessary. So findability, and it has broken down some of those dragons because the objects aren't so precious. So we now, in a way, it's very different. Like in the old days, like you said, you're in the archive and you had to make a choice. You spend money on photocopying, or you'd sit there and hand transcribe. And that was time and money. And now you can, like you say, you can just take a photograph of the thing and work on it later. And at the same time, it used to be this game of access, and now it's a really different scene. When it used to be like, do you really have access to that document? Do you know that fact? And now it's like we all know the same facts, and it's a matter of a discussion about what they mean. And I kind of prefer that than the older model.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming. I hope we'll see you back here on January 9th for the William Stafford birthday celebration. There are flyers over there to become a friend of the Hannon Library if you're so inclined. And let's have a big round of applause for Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody.